So when I was in college, I played. That's really loud. We got to stop letting these quiet people speak. They're all so quiet. You know who I'm talking about. So when I was in college, I played soccer, and I loved it. I played because they were like, hey, we need people. We need at least 11 on the field. Can you play? I was like, yeah. So that's how I got on the soccer team. And like I always played and like get in shape, and then once the season was over, not that I stopped eating like garbage during the season, but I'd eat like garbage again once the season's over. And so every year I had to like recondition and re-get in shape. Not that I was ever in shape during those first few years, but like the summer between before my senior year, before my last year of playing soccer, I was like, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to eat right. I'm going to, not count calories, but just measure what I was eating. I'm going to run every day. I'm going to go out to the soccer field every day, and so I'd run to keep my conditioning up. I would go on the soccer field to work on dribbling and ball handling and shooting. But the more important thing, especially for my position, was passing, specifically the long pass. Like I played the right wing, and so I'd run up the field and then run. It was exhausting. But the main point on attacking point was to get the ball to go in so that we could create, shooting experiences. And I did. I got good. I could place that ball. And I had spent all summer working on these skills, and I was so ready for the season. School starts, and we have to do the one thing that all of us hated doing. We had to play the alumni game. During the thing, all the alumni would come back, and the soccer players would want to relive their glory days and play against us, and it was annoying because we're like, why are we having a game right before our season starts where any of us could get injured, And it was also annoying because before that we had a team that had won a championship, and so we always had to play against them and just get squashed. But this year, they didn't have enough alumni come back. We were going to destroy them anyway. But they didn't have enough alumni go back, so they were like, hey, we're going to put, our manager on the team. And we were all really hesitant when the coach said that, because he's going to put the manager on the alumni team. Because he was dangerous. He was a dangerous player. He would crash into people. He wasn't, good at the really aggressive offensive, defensive style, but he loved to play that way. So we were all really like, someone's going to get injured. And sure enough, I got injured. I'm in the box, which if you know what that means in soccer, we want to foul people in the box, but I'm in the box and I'm going to go for a shot, and the guy decides he's going to tackle me. He's going to slide tackle me from behind, which is also a no-no. It's usually an automatic red card, and you're out of the game if it's done the way he did it, but he wasn't down on the ground yet when he made contact, so he was still going down. My leg was already very tight, and when he collided, it was the last thing, and I tore my calf muscle. My gastrocnemius was torn. And after, we tried to figure it out, and they figured out, oh, it's torn, you're going to be out for the season. This season, my last season, that I had spent all summer, I had spent 3 months working on to, be prepared for, was taken away by this person, and I was so mad. Every time I saw him, I would just, grumble under my breath or whatever, and it could had the possibility of ruining my day. And it wasn't until way later that I realized I am carrying this anger towards him because of something he did to me, but I'm here in my senior year of Bible college, and I'm supposed to have learned, how to be like Christ and how to forgive. And so one Sunday morning we're at church, and I just walked up to him and I was like, listen, I have carried this anger against you because of this imagined slight. I know you didn't mean to do it. I know it wasn't, some intentional thing, but I just wanted to say I forgive you, and I'm asking you for forgiveness for my anger. And he was distraught. He was just like, I felt so bad during this time. And so he forgave me of my rage against him in that same moment that I forgave him. But what was interesting was I realized my sin was the greater one. And I needed his forgiveness more than he needed mine. But he still needed mine because, like I said, he was distraught. That's what we're going to be talking about today is forgiveness. We're going to be looking in Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 through 25, the parable of the unforgiving servant. That's where we're going to be today. Coming into it, the one repeat that you're going to hear a lot is forgiveness is hard. Yeah, it just is. But that's where we're going to be. So if you will pray with me, we're going to jump into the scripture. Father, Father, forgiveness is so hard, especially because we focus on how we've been hurt. But you forgave us of all the hurt that we have caused you. And you're saying here in the scripture that we're going to look at that we need to show that forgiveness in kind to your people and people who you love. And so help us learn this lesson. Help us to soften our hearts as we try and figure out this whole forgiveness thing. It's in your Son's precious name that we pray. Amen. So before we jump into actually reading the parable, there's context is basically why Jesus gives this parable. So before we jump into the parable, we're going to read verses 21 and 22, which is why he gives it. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, how often shall I forgive my brother? How often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? Jesus said to him, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. Now, when Peter gives this number of 7, according to their tradition and stuff, he's actually being really generous, because at the time, the rabbinical teaching was 3. How many times must my brother sin against me before I stop forgiving him? 3. Once they're done, you don't have to forgive them anymore. And so Peter's actually being really generous. He's saying, hey, should we forgive them 7 times? You seem to care about forgiveness. Obviously, bigger numbers can be better. And Jesus kind of throws this thing of like, no. See, I want you to forgive them not just 7 times, but 70 times 7. Now, these numbers are kind of interesting. I don't know if this is what he meant, but their numbers are important, okay? So the reason why originally they were like 3 is one of those numbers of completion, according to like Hebrew studies and their numerology. 7 is also a number of completion, not just a number of completion, but also it represents a perfect number. And so it's possible that Peter's like, 3 is not enough, but 7 is completion and perfection. Am I supposed to forgive them 7 times? And Jesus throws out this different number of 7 times 70. Now, if you're not good at math, that's 490 times. You have to forgive someone 490 times before you no longer have to forgive them again. That's not what Jesus is saying. Actually, so if Peter is talking in this number of perfection and completion, Jesus is now saying not just 7 times 70, he's saying this number of perfection and completion times this number of perfection and completion, 7 times 10, which is another number that represents completion. He's saying to the completest possible amount, that's how you forgive them. He gives them this giant number, not so that they can say, well, I've tallied it up and I've forgiven them 490 times. Can you imagine how petty you would have to be to like just keep your little Excel document, forgave him for this and this and this, and now we're at 491, so I don't have to forget. That's not what Jesus is saying. He gives him just this vast difference, because what he wants to do is show the difference between our understanding. He's trying to illustrate the difference between our understanding of forgiveness and God's understanding of forgiveness. When I was going through Matthew with Simon, the common theme that we talked about is Jesus is always trying to get them to set their mind on the heavenly as opposed to the earthly. And that's what he's doing here again. He says, your rabbis teach you 3. You're trying to guess 7, but I'm trying to tell you, just don't. Don't forgive. That's what I'm trying to tell you. And so we have this, and now we're going to read further. We're going to go through verses 23 through 25 now. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to settle accounts with his slaves. When he had begun to settle them, one who owed him 10,000 talents, take into account that number, 10,000 talents, was brought to him. But since he did not have the means to repay, his Lord commanded him to be sold along with his wife and children and all that he had, and repayment to be made. Okay, so the first thing to note here in this part of the parable is that it was the king who initiated this settling of debts, all right? This servant, he owed this debt, and the word they use is slave, which is often translated as slave or servant. It's not the same way that we think of slave from the American thing. We've had this conversation. Indentured servants, but also could just be a servant, someone who worked for them. Like, One of the resources I was looking at said, like, to have a debt this big, he had to have been someone kind of important. So maybe like a governor of an area as opposed to the king of all the land. But either way, it is the king who initiates this. It is the king who initiates the settling of debts, and the servant did not know that that was coming. He knew it was coming down the line. He knew he'd have to pay this back, but he wasn't prepared for it in that moment. And so this story takes place just before, like, that final week before Easter, that final week before the death on the cross. And so Jesus is getting them ready. He's preparing their mind already for what he's going to say in chapter 24 of this same book, that same final week where he says, hey, you don't know the date that the Lord is coming back. He's preparing them for that. He has spent nearly 3 years with them, and now at this point, Jesus knows, I got, this last week and then another 40 days. So I've got like 50 to maybe 60, depending on how early he tells them this, days left with you. I got to get this information to you. So go ahead to the next slide. But he's preparing them for this discourse that he gives, and it's a long discourse in Matthew 24. But verse 42, just be alert, be ready. You don't know when it is. And this servant was not ready for his king to settle the accounts. Now, this man was not prepared, but it wouldn't have mattered. It wouldn't have mattered. Now, 10,000 talents is so much money. I want you to understand how much money that is. Okay? A talent, if it was of gold, which I think it's safe to assume that he's talking about a talent of gold here, would be worth somewhere around 16 to 20 years' wages. Just one talent, 20 years' wages. This man owed 10,000. Again, if you're not good at math, that's 160,000 years' wages that this man owed. And what's interesting about this is 10,000 is actually the biggest number in the Roman vocabulary. Now, they understood numbers that were larger than that, but if you wanted to say them, you had to do math. You had to say 2 10,000s or 3 10,000s, or you see the phrase myriads of myriads when they want to describe a million. That's 1,000 times 1,000. 10,000 is the largest one word in their vocabulary for numbers. That's what Jesus is saying. He's saying this debt is the biggest that it could be, and the amount of the debt, a gold talent, is the biggest that it could be. This is what that man owed. And this is what the man owed. And his Lord came to settle the debt that he could not repay. There's not a chance that he's going to be able to repay this. And the Lord said, his king said, I'm going to get something back, right? I'm going to get something back. So he decides to sell this man, his wife, and his children into slavery. Okay? And all his stuff would be sold as well to try and make back the debt. He's not going to get much off the stuff. And to be honest, the maximum amount that you could sell a person into slavery for at the time was 500 days' wages. 500 denarii is the max you could sell them for. So if he sold him and his wife, and it says children, so we have to assume there's at least 2, maybe there's more, he can get 500 for each. So he's at least getting 2,000 denarii back, 2,000 days' wages back, but the man owes him years upon years. But there is still a level of hope. See, the maximum amount of time that a Jew could be a slave or could have a slave was 7 years. Actually, that's the maximum amount. They were also supposed to set them free at Jubilee every year, or every time they had Jubilee and they celebrated, which we don't have evidence of them actually doing. But when Jubilee occurred, according to Old Testament, you had to set your slaves free. So the maximum amount that you could be a slave under one contract was 7 years. That's why Jacob in the Old Testament, did I get that name right? Yeah. Jacob in the Old Testament had to be a slave once for 7 years for Leah, and then again for 7 years for Rachel, was because that's the maximum amount. So he had to do it, and then he had to do it again. So there's something interesting there is, even though this man is still sold into the slavery, he's going to get out eventually, but he's still going to have to repay that debt. But he's going to have a way to get back to work and try and keep working on that debt. Which will bring us to verses 26 and 27. So the slave fell to the ground and prostrated himself before him, saying, "Have patience with me, and I will repay you everything." And the Lord of that slave felt compassion and released him and forgave him of the debt. This man drops not just to his knees in supplication, but fully prostrate, which is you are just on the ground. Your life is forfeit at that moment, which his life already was forfeit at that moment. But he drops down and says this phrase, "Please give me time and I will repay this debt. Just give me time. Please show me mercy." And more than likely, this man didn't expect to be forgiven this debt. It's a huge debt. Never forget how big this debt is. When I was reading through this and studying through this, I had a weird moment of, man, to know that I fit into that place, it's just amazing, God's love for us. That's how big of the debt that it is. That this man had no reason to suspect his king of forgiving him. And yet he did. Would you? Could you forgive someone 160,000 years' wages? That is a lot of money. But the man, in a last resort, desperate situation, just asks, "Please." And the king looked at him, and he showed him compassion, and he showed him mercy, and he forgave the whole of that man's debt, the entirety. To give a reprieve, and not only that, but he didn't send him to punishment. He just said, "Hey, we're square," okay? The king showed compassion, but it was only after it was asked for. And the compassion that he showed was greater than what was asked for. All he wanted was more time. Hey, just give me time, I'll figure this out, and we'll work something out. And he's just like, "It's forgiven. I forgive you of this debt." And that is, again, just so amazing about God's love that I just get lost in sometimes. But what does the man do? The story doesn't end there. The man goes off and, he walks off with this newfound freedom, the weight of his debt now off his shoulders. And we're going to read 28 through 30 and find out how he reacts to that. But that slave went out and found one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii. And he seized him and began to choke him, saying, "Pay back what you owe me." So his fellow slave fell to the ground and began to plead with him, saying, "Have patience with me, and I will repay you." But he was unwilling, and went and threw him in prison until he should pay back what he owed. And you just kind of got to wonder, dude, bro, really? Really, that's your reaction? It's just kind of disappointing. Like, if we try and get into the head and figure out why he did this, we could quickly come to the conclusion, hey, maybe, it's that he forgot about the forgiveness shown, but that seems a little too generous. I think what might be more likely is he's so glad in this forgiveness that he now wants to maybe collect some of the money that's owed to him so he can give it to that king in tribute. Like, hey, I know you forgave me this debt, but this is how great of a king you are, and so here I'm going to give you this, and it's only 100 denarii, but that's what I can give you. And so he finds someone. He finds someone that borrowed money from him, and it says 100 denarii, which, as we mentioned, a denarius is the standard labor for, just a farm field worker, day's wages, 1 denarius. Okay? This man owed 100 denarius, so a little over 3 months' salary, which, that's no small fee. If I tried to keep 3 months' salary from the government, which I owe them in taxes, they'd come after me and probably do the exact same thing. I think, actually, they would do the same thing. But I don't want to get into that point. But nonetheless, 3 months out, it's not a small debt. It's really not. But in comparison, it is. It's not even, like, even if he were to give this money, it's not even a drop in the bucket to what he owed this king, but he's going to give him what he can. And it's less than even a fifth of what he was going to get if he had sold all his family into slavery. But, so Jesus does this thing here, okay? The debt owed to the servant was big, okay? The debt owed was big. And with that, Jesus is trying to show, like, I'm not denying the hurt that is caused by someone sinning against you, because remember, if we go back to 21 and 22, that's what this is about. It's about your brother sinning against you. Okay, he's saying, I'm not going to deny that you have been hurt and that it is small, but when you put it in comparison, when you put it next to the amount of hurt that you have caused the king, or for us, as we learn later, this is reference to God, the amount that we have hurt him and the amount that he has forgiven us, the hurt that we have experienced from our brother is so small in comparison. It is 160,000 years, as we said, compared to 3 months. But the servant who had been forgiven, he hears the pleas of this man, the same plea that he had just made to the king. Almost word for word, he hears this plea, and he ignores it. He assaults this man who owes him 100 denarii. And then, in a poor imitation of what his master was going to do to him, he sends him to jail. And I say it's a poor imitation because he's not going to be able to sell him to slavery. He's going to make way more off of that, so that's not going to work. But he puts him in jail. See, the king was at least going to try and get back what he, some of what he owed. And also, there's still the option of when Jubilee comes along or when that 7 years is up, he's still going to have to pay back the debt. He's still going to have to work. But this guy instead throws him in jail. I don't know if you know this. You can't exactly work in the fields when you're in jail. And he says he puts him in jail until he can pay back the debt, meaning someone else has to pay the debt for him, or he's in jail until he dies. He gives him a life sentence. When that same servant comes to collect his debt, he doesn't try to have the servant enter servitude to pay the debt. He doesn't try and give him a chance out. He doesn't even try and sell his belongings. He puts him in jail until he can pay the debt. And by that, like I said, he gives this man a life sentence. Next one. Next slide. That's my fault. I got off my thing, and he's trying to read and follow me, so that's my fault. But unless someone else, like I said, was going to come and pay his debt, this man who was forgiven a debt so great there is no conceivable way for him to pay it back, he goes and he asks, he refuses to show that same mercy. A new servant had a large debt, yes, but he could conceivably pay it off. You can save and save and save, a little bit up and eventually pay off that 3 months. But he doesn't give him that option. Now, sometimes in Jesus' parables, the meaning and the intent can be hard to suss out until it's explained later. This one is not that way. It's very clear what Jesus is saying, okay? We are the servant who was forgiven of that ultimate debt. Though we may not all be as unforgiving as this one, we are that servant. And I do suspect to some degree we do struggle with forgiveness. As I said in the beginning, forgiveness is hard. The wrongs done to us, the debts owed to us are much easier to look at and to focus and to drive us than our own debts that have been forgiven. See, sometimes we hold people to a higher standard than we often hold ourselves, a kind of rule for thee, but not for me type mentality. Forgiven of a life debt, several lives' debts, and yet not able to forgive one that's much smaller. And that can bring us to a very dangerous place, which Jesus explains here in verses 31 to 35 as we finish out our passage today. So when his fellow slaves saw that what had happened, they were deeply grieved and came and reported it to their Lord, all that had happened. Then summoning him, his Lord said to him, "You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not also have had the mercy on your fellow slave in the same way that I had mercy on you?" His Lord moved with anger, handed him over to his torturers until he should repay all that was owed to him. My heavenly Father will also do the same to you if each of you does not forgive his brother from your heart. There are two very dangerous implications at the end of this parable. I showed you mercy. Should you not have in kind shown that same mercy to your fellow servant? It says, see, the king is better than this other servant. They know that dynamic, that relationship. But he says, this is your fellow servant. You guys are equals. If someone who is greater than you, with a greater debt owed, can forgive you, why can you not forgive someone who is equal to you, who is owed so much less? And the king's course of action is that first very serious implication. See, earlier he forgave the man's debt. But now, after seeing how the servant has handled this freedom and handled his fellow, that debt falls back on that man. The king's mercy is removed from the servant because he himself could not show mercy. Mercy and forgiveness are hard. We hurt from the things that are done to us. The things that hurt can be lasting. All right? And to show forgiveness to one who has caused that hurt can be unthinkable at times. Some of you are aware, and some of you aren't, that in the latter part of last year, I got scammed out of a lot of money by someone who came asking for help. I knew the church couldn't really help, so I was like, okay, here, I'll help. And then there was something else, and I'll help. And then there was something else, and I'll help. And eventually there were gaps in the story, but they were easy enough for me to fill in the blank because I wanted to believe him and because he was very good at his story and he was very capable of manipulating emotions, and he made me want to believe. He made me want to believe his story. He made me want to believe that that he cared about the details of my life. And the reason I bring this up is because Friday, I thought I had moved past it, but Friday I have to go do laundry, okay? And the change machine is broken. So I have to go to the bank. I have to go to the bank to get a roll of quarters. And I go to the bank, and it's the same bank where I had to go and use the ATM to withdraw money for this person, to share with him, to help him get along his way. And as I got closer, I started feeling that anger kind of build up again, okay? And when I left, I was mad. I was mad. And I thought it was interesting that this whole thing, is right before I have to give a sermon on forgiveness. See, the pain that he caused was real. That pain that was caused not because he took money, but because he manipulated and used me in that manner was real, and it hurts, and forgiveness is hard. And I'm not at the point yet where I'm ready. I even thought I need to just say it out loud. I need to just say, I need to come to where I can forgive him. But I can't. I can't say it right now. I'm not there. I may be getting closer, but I'm not there yet. Forgiveness is hard. I'm going to go off on a weird side tangent real quickly. That doesn't mean that if someone has hurt you, that you keep allowing them to hurt you. That's not what forgiveness is. That pain is real, and you do need to cut yourself off sometimes to protect yourself. I had to cut this person off, blocked his number, did all that stuff. Told him, hey, if you come back, I'm going to, report this to the police because the amount of money that you took and scammed is ridiculous. But I've had to cut him off in that manner. So it's okay in your forgiveness to also protect yourself. It doesn't mean you forget that what heart has done to you, but you still have to forgive him, and that is hard. The simplicity of this is, it's rough, because his thing is you have to forgive them. It is simple. It is a simple command, but it is not an easy one to follow. But he warns us here that if we don't forgive those who have wronged us and sinned against us, why should God forgive us when we wrong him, when we sin against him? To say our debt to him would be in the millions, according to this thing, would be a gross understatement, especially if we compare the debt that they owe to us to just maybe a few bucks. by comparison. See, it feels more real to us because of that hurt, but we have to remember we hurt God too with our actions, the way we behave, the way we flee. If you want good examples of that, go read the Minor Prophets and go read the way that Israel is described in their idolatry and in their sin. We refuse, but when we refuse to show mercy, we basically just mistreat. To use maybe some harsh imagery, we defecate on the gift of mercy that God has shown us when we refuse to show mercy to others. And Jesus ends this parable very clearly. If we can't soften our hearts and find in us the ability to forgive, how then should the Father deal with us in turn? And so I don't have some application at the bottom of your page. I don't have something, but really what I want you to do is take time sometime during this week. If you got to write it on your page, if you keep your notes, if you got to write it somewhere where you're going to see it, I want you to think of a name of someone who you need to forgive, someone you haven't forgiven. And just spend time in prayer. What do I got to do to do this? They may not know that they've hurt you, but that doesn't change the fact that you need to forgive them and let them know that they are forgiven, because that can be freeing for them. But even if you're not doing it so that it's freeing for them, it will be freeing for you. Like I said in the very beginning, that person who hurt me very, very lightly didn't mean it. I mean, not lightly, it was a big thing. But when I forgave him and then he forgave me, our relationship was strengthened. And it was better. And he was someone who, like, we had often kind of, like, just avoided. But at that point, our relationship was better. And I felt better. And learning how to forgive is something that just takes that weight off your shoulders, that huge debt that man owed. It's the same when we forgive. And so that's your challenge. Find that person. And just bring yourself to a point where you can genuinely and authentically forgive them. If not for their well-being, then do it for yours. Because this parable tells us what happens when we can't find it in ourselves to be forgiving. Pray with me. Father God, you are so filled with compassion and mercy